Hi everybody, my name is Samantha Pecoraio and I chose to do my project on Plato, and modern day media ethic problem would be media biased. So I'm going to start out with some facts about Plato's life and his background. So Plato was a classical Greek philosopher. He was born around 428 BCE and died about 348 BCE. Plato was taught by Socrates and in turn became Aristotle's teacher. These three laid the fundamentals of Western philosophy. Plato's real name was actually Aristocles, but he had a really broad forehead, so they nicknamed him Plato, which is really interesting. Plato was a mathematician, a philosopher, and the founder of an academy in Athens, which was for higher education. Plato, although his teacher Socrates had a huge influence on his thinking and teachings, he didn't really make it known that he followed him for some unknown reasons. In Plato's works, he never makes himself a part of the dialogues, and interesting fact is that Plato also claims to have never heard any of his dialogues. According to HermesPress.com, one of Plato's most important contributions to Western thought was his conception of forms. He saw ultimate reality composed of two distinct worlds or dimensions of being. I thought it was really interesting, his divided line schema. It's about the cave and the people being in the cave. So the first position is the imagination or fantasy, which is in the back of the cave, and the people are bound, so they're only facing the wall. So the only thing that they can see is the shadows that are projected on the wall. Then the cave position number 2 is the rhetorical belief or conviction, and this is when the people are turned toward the fire at the cave opening. They're unbound, and they can see figures from outside of the cave, and they're projecting shadows on the wall. So the third cave position was called mathematical understanding, and this is when the people were actually able to escape from the cave, and they were dazzled by the sunlight, so they could only see shadows. And then the fourth cave position is the dialectical reason, and this is when the people were able to adjust to the sunlight, and they could perceive visible objects, and they actually apprehended the sun. So this ties in with media bias, because journalists who do media bias and who are biased to certain, conservatives, liberalism, right wing, left wing, stuff like that. This ties in with it because the first two cave positions show people who are completely blinded by pretty much everything, and they only know what they're told, and they can't actually figure it out for themselves. And that's kind of like people nowadays where they just watch stuff on the news and they just automatically think that their way of thinking is right, and that's it, and they're not really open-minded to anything else. And then the last two cave positions show that the people are actually out and they're able to see for themselves what's going on. So that's where, the bias comes in again, because when you realize that some news stations are being biased and you are actually exposed to different ways of thinking, then you're able to develop your own kind of thought process instead of just sticking to what you're told. Okay, so we're moving into the topic of media bias. Now, I said a little bit about it, but for those of you who don't know exactly what the meaning is, media bias refers to the bias of journalists and news producers within the mass media in the selection of which events and stories are reported and how they are covered. And that's actually quoted from presentation.pecoraio. Sometimes journalists aren't exposed to all of the story or the facts, and sometimes they are, and they just decide that they don't want to report everything because they don't want to make their favored person sound bad. So some factors that weigh in on why media bias occurs is government influence. Some governments will actually censor newspapers, and this actually happened in Africa, where one of the newspapers was actually shut down for about 3 months. There is the censorship, and then there's owners of the news sources that will, have an influence on what you're writing, and they might not like it, so they would tell you no, you can't write it. And the intention of the reporters, like I mentioned before, if the reporter likes somebody, say a politician, they're not going to say mean stuff about them, even if it is a negative story about them. They're going to try to pull all the positive out of the story rather than the negative. So since Gutenberg invented the printing press, there was media bias even back then. Historians believe that publishers would print stories that only interested the powerful social groups in the 1600s. And that's actually probably because in the 1600s, the only people who were able to buy newspapers were the more aristocratic and more popular people who had money. You know, the scribes and stuff didn't really have money to buy the newspapers. So, in the 19th century, journalists were recognized the concept of unbiased reporting, and they realized how beneficial it was to not be a biased reporter. And they addressed the media bias, and it actually became an important part in journalistic ethics. But some news organizations in present day are still being accused of media bias. So, an example of media bias during the American Civil War is when President Abraham Lincoln accused newspapers in the border states of bias in favor of the Southern cause. He ordered many of those papers to close. So I actually have an example of the right-wing and left-wing bias. It's two videos, and it's from NBC's newscast, and I actually got it from the website, and I will screenshot it and I'll show you guys. So if you want to take a look and see the bias, the video actually points out some stuff. So I hope you guys enjoy it.
Good morning. Breaking news. President Bush makes a surprise visit to Afghanistan, his first ever. Meanwhile, back home, his approval rating sank to an all-time low.
The president's travels come at a time when his popularity at home has itself gone south. His latest job approval rating down to 34, colored by a spike in violence in Iraq and public anxiety about an Arab firm running U.S. ports. A difficult stretch for the president.
Well, meantime, President Obama has just returned to Washington this morning following a surprise visit with U.S. service members in Afghanistan, and he has a busy Memorial Day planned.
Okay, so let me just point out that NBC reported the trips to Afghanistan by President Bush and President Obama, and it's clear which party that this network actually pulls for. And so Bush's trip was referred to as a publicity stunt, while his approval ratings were falling. But the funny thing is that Obama's rates were just as low as Bush's, and they neglect to mention that. Okay, so generally, Plato's goal is that everyone should think of everyone else as a member of their family, that everybody should be treated the same, there should be no strife between people, and they should all desire the same thing, which is harmony, temperance, and gentleness toward fellow citizens. Now, he also believed in truths. So he believed that, you know, if you're a reporter, or even if you're just like a regular person, you should tell the truth about stuff. So if Plato was around today, he would be really upset with the media bias that is very apparent in the news organizations, the really big conglomerates that roam today. He would be upset about it. So I'm going to quote from an article. It was off of mercatornet.com, and it's called The Appearance and Reality, What Plato Can Teach Journalists and the Media. So, quote, "Were the great Plato around today, I doubt he would, having cast his eye over the mainstream media, have pronounced the end of the world. Perhaps he would have looked rather mournfully at the chasers after shadows, shackled by their own minds, and what they wrongly, in my view, take to be an irreformable, trivially minded public. He would have pointed to the exit, where a few beams of sunlight shone through. He would have asked the media professionals to look round just once and enjoy reality. Should they keep their heads firmly set and their eyes directed fixedly at the wall, he would not have declared an end to civilization as we know it, but he may well have announced the end of mainstream media." And that ties into the cave stuff that I was talking about earlier. Thanks for watching. That's my media bias and how Plato would feel about it today. Sorry it's a little long. I tried to edit it down as much as I could. I hope you guys enjoyed it. See ya.